I'm Rabbi Deborah Schuldenfrei, and I'm the head of school of VBS Day School, which is a K-6 elementary in Encino. And we are part of the Valley Beth Shalom community. And so we're so proud to be here and to share our love of Shtisel and Judaism with all of you. So thank you for being here tonight. And with me tonight, we're very honored and excited to have Allison Josephs. Give us a wave, Allison, so we see you on the screen. Allison is the founder and director of Jew in the City, which makes engaging and meaningful Orthodox Judaism known and accessible. And so we're going to get to Allison and her work in a moment and how she's the right guide to us through Shtisel. So we're very excited. So again, I want to invite, there's so many people on Zoom tonight. We're happy to see all of you. We know we have people on YouTube and Facebook also. So that's terrific. And I'm sorry that you might not be able to engage with us the way our friends are on Zoom. But if you are on Zoom with us, first of all, please turn on your cameras. Let us see your punam, because your punam matter. And the Kabbalists teach us that when we look in each other's eyes, that's one way of inviting the Shekhinah, God's holy presence, or as Rabbi Schulweiss taught, the godliness between us. And even though we're not in person, we can still do that on Zoom. So please turn on your cameras. And I also want to invite you to find your reactions button again on your device. So we just wanted to get a sense of who's here with us tonight. Welcome everyone into the room. So before we begin using my educator brain, I want to invite you to participate as follows. So find either your like button or your heart button, and depending on who you are, you might pick a different thing. So use your button if you are a person on this call who identifies as Jewish. If you identify as Jewish, you can just share your thumbs up, your heart button. Okay, some of you are waving. That's the old-fashioned Zoom button. That's fine too. Raising hands is something I'm familiar with as an educator. Okay, now I want you to raise your hand, either your virtual hand or your thumbs up, if you have been to Israel. If you have been to Israel, give us a thumbs up. Okay, so most of us have been to Israel. Lovely. That's a very important place to visit or live. How many of us have lived in Israel? Have we lived in Israel for a period of time? Okay, about a quarter. That's remarkable. I want to know how many of us have spent Shabbat with an Orthodox friend or family member. Have you spent Shabbat with someone who identifies as either mitzvah observant, Shomer Shabbat, or Orthodox? Give me a thumbs up or a heart or a yes. Okay. Now I'd like to know how many of us have either friends, or many of us might have relatives who identify as Shomer Mitzvot, or they identify as Shomer Shabbat, or they identify as Orthodox. Give us a thumbs up if you have a friend or a family member who identifies as Orthodox. So most of us have some familiarity from the people I'm seeing on Zoom with someone, either a friend or a family member. Okay, this is the hardest question, and I'm giving you 3 options because it's always hard to choose. So here's going to be your choices. I'm going to tell you your choices first, and then you vote. So tell me, are you here because you want to know more about the show, or wait, more about Orthodoxy, or about the intersection between the two? Okay, so you'll have 3 choices, and I don't care if you vote twice. It's fine. We're not actually counting ballots tonight. That's a whole nother lecture. Okay, we don't count lectures today. We don't count votes. Okay, so tell me if you're here to learn more about the show and just talk about your love of the show or interest in it. Give us a thumbs up. A lot of us. Okay, good. Tell us if you're here to learn more about Orthodoxy. Okay, we got a bunch of people here for that. And what about the intersection? Okay, now I want you to just raise your hand if you're my mom and you have to be here because she's not raising her hand, but that's okay. I didn't ask her before. I so humiliated her. Okay, but she's here. So my mom is here making sure that I do. Okay. The next very important thing, and this is something in Los Angeles with Hollywood that we take quite seriously. So I want you all to hold this, that we may have to share some spoilers tonight. So if you are one that cannot tolerate spoilers, please log off or watch on a mode where you can fast forward if there might be things that you don't want to hear. Oh, and my mother-in-law and father-in-law are here too. So they're not afraid to wave because they have the same last name as I do now. So they are self-identified. Good to see you. See, we have Las Vegas, the Midwest, New York. We just have people all over, Los Angeles. Okay. So we're so excited to have Allison here to tell us a little bit more about her work and her life and her choices, and to share with us very transparently about that, why her work is so valuable to her. And then we're going to talk about the show as well. But at this moment, I'm going to hand it over to Allison to continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, and so glad to be here tonight and connecting with Jews from all over. I feel like now, I think as we're all sort of feeling this rise in anti-Semitism, the idea of coming together from different communities and building bridges and coming together to celebrate something wonderful and positive is a really nice feeling. So thank you for coming out and coming to hear this. So just a little bit about my background and the work that I do and why, I talk about Orthodox Jews a lot. I was raised kind of as an Orthodox Jewish bigot. I was a proud Jew growing up. And I don't know, I guess we put ourselves into boxes, but sort of the messaging I got growing up was, as conservative, we were sort of middle of the road and like perfectly balanced. Reform didn't do enough. Orthodox was crazy. We had the perfect balance. I guess every Jew kind of thinks where they are is where they should be, where people with a lot of opinions. And it wasn't just that, I thought that Orthodox was too much. I actually had revulsion towards them. My father took care of Hasidic Jews when he was doing his residency in Manhattan. And some of my earliest memories were him coming home and saying, they're dirty, they're smelly, they're ignorant, they can't speak English. And so the truth is that I actually kind of dehumanized them. I really saw them as the other. I saw them as an embarrassment. I was proud to be Jewish, and I felt really proud of our culture and our food and our jokes and our accomplishments. But I really saw the Orthodox as something that was kind of like bringing our people down. The quick version of the story is that when I was 8, there was a triple murder in my school. A father went crazy, killed both of his kids and himself. And I was sort of launched into this existential crisis of why I'm alive. And to make a long story short, I ended up connecting with a modern Orthodox teacher in high school. And everything that I thought Orthodox Jews and Orthodoxy were, which was basically based on my father's negative experiences and what I saw in media, had led me to just think that this was a horrible way of life. But when I met this teacher, I saw that there was so much more openness and so much more nuance and so much more positivity than I knew was possible. And so I slowly started to adopt an Orthodox life. My family and friends thought that I had lost my mind. And I actually challenged my father, especially if you think I've, joined a cult and please try to save me. And so he began to learn to try to save me. And then he actually joined me. So both of my parents, both of my sisters are all Orthodox as well. My sisters, they all made Aliyah actually. And so I felt that the life that I was living, I still felt empowered. I have an Ivy League education. We travel all over the world. I feel like I have this beautiful life. And I wish when I was that kid that was struggling and looking for meaning, I wish there had been a me out there somewhere, just sort of giving me an insight into what this world could look like. And then struggling me as a kid could have decided, do I want some of this? Do I want all of this? Do I want none of this? But at least I wanted more information as opposed to only the most extreme negative stories, because that's really all I was getting. And so as I thought about how to deliver this information, this neat thing called YouTube arrived on the scene in 2005 is when I made our first video, Jew in the City. It is not copying that show that you think it's copying. There was actually a scripted YouTube show called Lonely Girl 15, who was a lonely girl who was 15. I said to myself, what am I? I'm Jewish. I live in the city. So I became Jew in the City. So it was really a way to use social media, which democratized information, to be able to tell what my life looked like personally, as opposed to having a mainstream media outlet kind of spin my life into what they thought that I was. I've had non-Orthodox men tell me that I have Stockholm syndrome, and I sort of feel like, why are you mansplaining to me like what I should be doing? This is my life. I feel like it's a meaningful way to live. There's certainly challenges in the community. It's not a perfect community, but I'm here by choice, and it's a beautiful way to live, according to me. And so I started Jew in the City as sort of a platform to share more of those stories. And so we try to share broad stories on Jew in the City, a variety of profiles of people from across the spectrum of Orthodoxy. I would say one of the misconceptions that I had before I became Orthodox, I didn't really understand how diverse the community was, or there really are so many differences. And we try to show meaning in mitzvahs. We try to show how Jewish wisdom can be applicable to, sort of thorny questions or issues of the times that we're trying to wrap our arms around. And then we also talk about the challenges. We talk about facing the shortcomings of the community, because being open to doing tshuva, to, self-reflection and improving, that's, a foundational Jewish value. And if we can't sort of look our problems in the face, then we really do have a problem. And so that's sort of what I do over at Jew in the City. And so I love sort of talking about Orthodox Jews in the media and explaining traditions. And so I'll give you a little bit of my thoughts on Shtisel. So I heard about the show years ago, and I heard a lot of Orthodox Jews like the show, and that really surprised me, because it's not so often that likable Orthodox characters are featured in movie and TV. We actually, one of our writers who's from LA, she's not one of ours, a fan of ours who is a writer and lives in LA. There we go, it came out better. Told me that she wanted to create a test, and she named it after me, the Joseph's test. There are similar tests for women, for different minorities, to see, does this piece of media sort of only repeat stereotypes, or does it show broader characters? So she named it the Joseph's test, and it's on our website on jewinthecity.com. And the idea to say is, does the whole plot line only have to be about being Jewish? Okay, so Shtisel is basically only about being Jewish. A lot of times, Jews are brought into TV shows as sort of like a whole challah, to walk in and be like, oh, do you need some challah right now? I found that a lot of times when there's like sitcoms, the Jewish character is kind of always holding some sort of ritualistic object, because we can't just be people. We can just be people without constantly doing a mitzvah. Does the character only get empowered by leaving the community? That's a narrative that we've seen a lot of. And I guess I want to just point out that if we keep on seeing, and by the way, my organization now actually deals with the ex-Hasidic phenomenon. We have a division called Makom, where we help ex-ultra-Orthodox Jews who feel displaced, like they don't belong in their Makom, in their place, and we help them find another more positive place within the observant Jewish world. So I know this phenomenon very personally at this point, but if we only see Jews escaping from terrorizing, terrifying, horrific Jewish environments, we have to give some thought about how that sort of looks in this time now of increasing anti-Semitism, of increasing vilification. I would say it does not bode well. I would say that it actually makes our religion look insane. And again, people can be on a spectrum of, observing or not observing, of having more or less respect for it. But when the characters we see again and again, can only sort of self-actualize or lead a positive life when they escape Jewish tradition, that kind of bothers me. And so what I heard about Shtisel was that it was people being Orthodox and being happy about that. So I found it pretty interesting. So I finally got to watching season 1 and season 2 a few years ago. And overall, I found it to be a very positive show. Beautifully written, beautifully acted. I think the Shtisel phenomenon, I think what is why people go so crazy about the show, and this is just based on my own bias, so if you disagree with me, you're certainly welcome to. I think seeing the humanity in those crazy looking Jews is shocking to a whole lot of people. The way that I looked at them, I would like watch them walking down the streets in their beards and their wigs and pushing the strollers and be like, I know we both say the Shema, and like, I know we both have Hanukkah, but like, I don't feel any connection to those people. I never saw the men smiling. I never really exchanged more than like a word or two with someone on the street. To see the laughter and the joy and the humanity, I think has actually shocked a lot of people. And what I would say is maybe maybe Hollywood could have done better to show its humanity before that. And this is actually feedback I've given to the Hasidic community before, the ultra-Orthodox community. Like, do you realize that smiles are given out more freely on the street, and how people might see you, walking along? So I kind of look at every issue on both sides. I'll tell you my one gripe with Shtisel, as someone that wants to make an observant life feel reachable. And when I say an observant life, it doesn't need to be the whole package. It could be observances that make your life feel more meaningful, and each person gets to decide what that is. But when Shtisel is sort of showing the most stringent opinion on every single issue, because we are dealing with Yerushalmim, one of the most strict, ultra-Orthodox Haredi groups that's out there, while that's a correct depiction of their community, it's so not reflective of so many parts of my life. And I had an interesting conversation with one of my good friends from high school, who's Reform, and she watched me become Orthodox. And she wanted to just talk Shtisel with me, because like, what better, than talking Shtisel with your Orthodox girlfriend from high school? And I said to her, I like the show, but like, it seems kind of extreme. And she's like, that's pretty funny, Allison, coming from you. I said, why? Because you think my life is like Shtisel? She's like, yeah, kind of. And I found that to be kind of surprising because, again, my husband and I are both Ivy League educated. Like we were involved in media and the news and travel, and our kids understand the world. We don't expose them to like every last thing. We do things age appropriately, but like we've really taught them to sort of hold complex ideas of these are our values. This is what we believe. And we also make room for people having different experiences, coming to different conclusions, holding different truths. And so it was surprising to me because when I look at Shtisel, I see some of these really closed-minded characters that are kind of xenophobic and practices that we would never do. And it surprised me that she saw that in me. And so I really appreciate the opportunity now to try to get through some of those details and try to explain what different communities do. So there's more of an understanding about sort of the diversity within Orthodoxy.
So, Allison,
and so with that,
Allison, can I just put a pin in this, right? Because I think this is a really important point, especially, we're a conservative synagogue. I happen to be a Reform rabbi that leads a conservative Jewish day school. And we have lots of different affiliations and spirituality and people here. But I think what resonated with me when we spoke in advance, I think one of my children is about to join us. So that should be very delightful. So this is part of the fun of Zoom at home. Maybe not. Okay. One of the things you mentioned to me that really stood out was the question of how extreme is this Orthodox experience. And so I love, in like a Gilmore Girls style, how quickly you talk, because I can match you. We can have that very fast. But I want to just pause and slow down the conversation here, because what you're telling us is that this family resonates with us. The Shtisel family as a whole, and all the different parts of it, and all of the different generations that are folded into the storytelling. And you started off by talking about in your own work in outreach. Is it okay to call it outreach work?
Sure. Yeah.
That you feel that it's especially important now when we are seeing a rise of anti-Semitism in the world and in the United States. And so I want to have you elaborate a little further on how is your modern Orthodox lifestyle different from the extreme version of Orthodoxy that we see on the show?
Sure. So I guess I want to even clarify one thing before we even go from modern to ultra.
Sure.
Even within every group, it's like we're a little bit crazy. What can I say? You knew that already. You've been living this life for all your life. Every division within Orthodoxy has divisions inside the divisions. So within modern Orthodoxy, we literally have left-wing modern, centrist modern, right-wing modern. Within the Haredi world, the Haredi world gets divided into two main groups, which is Hasidic on one side and Yeshivish or Litvish with a Lithuanian sort of background on the other side. That's where Shtisel falls in, on the non-Hasidic side. They look so Hasidic, except they're not. And then within Yeshivish and Hasidic, and then Chabad, which is a branch of Hasidic, there's divisions within all of those: left-wing Yeshivish, right-wing Yeshivish, left-wing, Hasidic, right-wing Hasidic. So even speaking about how my life differs from Shtisel is probably like maybe the second degree from the most sort of insular and extreme positions to be taking within the Haredi world in Israel. Sure. So, because I want to sort of put that out there, because you could meet people from the Haredi ultra-Orthodox world that actually are not that different from me. There's sort of some cultural differences, but practically speaking, we're pretty similar. So I want to just throw that in there just to make it even more complicated. But I would say some of the main differences is that we believe in secular education in my world. My kids go to Jewish day schools that prepare them to go to Ivy League schools should they choose. All sorts of extracurriculars, all sorts of, interactions with the larger world. We believe in science and Torah. So for us, believing that, the Torah is from God and that, there is a creation story doesn't mean that we don't also believe in the Big Bang Theory and evolution. We believe in continuing to find ways to include women in higher education. My daughter has been learning a page of Talmud every single day since the new cycle of Daf Yomi started. And so while we don't have women rabbis, around the corner, I have an incredible Talmudic scholar who wears a wig like I do. She's a powerhouse, and we're so proud to have our sons and our daughters learn from her and sort of see that she exists and what she's doing. Even the term feminist, I've sort of been a lifelong, for me, sometimes for some people, the word feminist is like, has so much to unpack. For me, it's so simple. Women should have choices. It shouldn't be hard to just say, to support women making choices. And by the way, I will just call out for the people that don't like the choices that I make sometimes. I feel like if you really want to be a feminist, respect the choices that I've made. If you don't want to wear a wig yourself, then don't tell me that I have some sort of like internalized misogyny for living an Orthodox life. Because I have been told that, and I think that is sort of some recalculation that needs to be done on, the people that think that they're so open-minded.
I really understand that. Can I ask another question about that? Sure. I know you told me that I can ask almost anything.
Sure.
I want to start with feminism, and then I want to go a little into Zionism, which I think are two really important hot button issues right now. And specifically where we see feminist models in the show, because I know people are here in part to learn about Orthodoxy, in part to learn about the show. But I feel like there's so many elements of the, I'll just call Black hat life that is so fascinating as also a feminist. Because like at times there's things that I think, wow, well, that would make even Phyllis Schlafly really proud. And at times I'm like, well, that would make Gloria Steinem proud. And that would not, like, that would be very uncomfortable. But one of the things that is so fascinating is about women working and women supporting the learning of the men in the families. And I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit and also continue about the feminism.
Yeah, so the dynamic of the husband sort of learning full-time as his career is actually prohibited in the Talmud. All of the rabbis of the Talmud said you should never do such a thing. All of the great Torah scholars of the Talmud said that, you should always have a livelihood. You should make a parnasa along with your work. And they actually command you to give your son an education, to give him skills and training. And they say, if you don't do that, you will teach him to be a ganef, to be a thief. So what happened? How do we have these societies where they disregarded this? The Holocaust. I mean, this is just always, what Jewish talk could come up without that happening? Because so many Jewish institutions and yeshivas got destroyed during the Shoah, there became sort of a generation of rabbis that broke this rule. And they felt like we have to rebuild all of the Torah scholars that perished in the Holocaust. We must open up these, bigger and better yeshivas, and we'll just be learning Torah 24/7. And so I understand on one hand that the desire to rebuild from the destruction was so powerful from a couple of generations ago. Practically speaking, the Torah doesn't actually allow it. Jewish law doesn't actually allow it, and it causes some problems. In my community, what we consider to be ideal, going back to the Torah ideas of this, is that you could have some, time to just, sit and do your studies. Even when you're first married, my husband and I went to Israel for a couple of years, and he learned in Kollel there. I was the Kollel wife supporting him for a couple of years, but that was not a long-term plan. He's a lawyer now. The idea is that, there should be sort of set aside time to kind of always study while, having the work. And then sort of your top learners of your generation, the people that have the most capability in terms of, really mastering Talmud and Jewish law, those should be the people within the community that are supported to become sort of your next sort of illustrious rabbis. And so this model, this system of having the men learn full time, forces the woman. It's actually against the ketubah. The ketubah says that he will support her. That's part of what he owes in the marriage. And so all sorts of problems arise when this breaks down.
You just mentioned ketubah, and it made me think of one of the characters that I secretly kind of really like in the show is Tzvi Aryeh. Who is who is the brother of Akiva.
Yeah.
And there is in either, I think it's the second season, I think I just froze for a second, or maybe we lost Allison. So there is a few episodes where Tzvi Aryeh is trying to come into his own as being a voice, a singing voice for the community.
Yeah.
And he's struggling with this. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, if you remember that particular part.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, there is an idea of sort of prioritizing Torah learning, that Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, that, you know, if you learn Torah, it's sort of equivalent to all the mitzvahs at once. And so you have certain communities, like in the most right-wing circles of the Black Hat world, especially the Lithuanian strain. If I can just take a moment now and to break down the Hasidic and Lithuanian strain, when this break-off started in the 1800s with the Baal Shem Tov, and the Lithuanians were like sort of the super scholars. They did this thing called the pin test, where they would basically, they had photographic memories, they're top scholars, and they would take the Talmud, which, just to give you an idea of how long the Talmud is, 63 volumes. If you learn a double-sided page every single day, it will take you about 7.5 years to finish. So they would memorize every single page and put a pin through the Talmud, and then they could tell you every single letter that pin went through because they had every single page photographically memorized. So that was in Lithuania. That was what was happening. What I found out recently, by the way, is that the people from Lithuania, either they got out before the Holocaust, so they came to the US, or they came to Yerushalayim and became some of the Rishonim you see there in Shtisel. The ones that stayed for the war, the entire community was decimated. So if you see a modern day person with a clean shaven face and just a black hat, but no curly payas, that's probably someone from the yeshivish world. Either his family got out before the war, or he's a descendant of someone Hasidic. The people that stayed in Lithuania, they were just killed. They were killed in their homes. So that was the Lithuanian branch. The Hasidic branch that started with the Baal Shem Tov was kind of like the hippie Jews. It was the Jews that didn't have as much access to the knowledge. They were kind of the peasants. They were the farmers. They were not the scholars. They were in Russia. And the Baal Shem Tov basically came and said, you can also serve God. You can serve God with your heart, with your soul, with your joy, with your song, with your dance. And so it sort of became this Judaism centered around the Rebbe sort of as the leader, kind of giving them their Torah, and then going to these tishes, going to these places where they would just celebrate in a much more sort of Leibedik and joyful way. That's not the Shtisel world. Shtisel certainly does have joy, but the world that you see there is a little bit more of a colder, a little more of an ascetic type of life. What was the original question that we did? Sorry, what was the question?
I was asking about the Aryeh and he
fine.
wanted to sing, you know, and that's, to me, it was such a curious example, because it's literally about how is this man going to find his voice, right?
So this is why I gave that whole introduction. Yes. because in the Lithuanian model, the Torah study is so prioritized.
Yes.
They almost don't believe in sort of room for any other development of self. That's what I was getting down to. So because they have this idea that Talmud Torah, learning of Torah, is equal to all mitzvos, there is this, in my community, what we would say is that we're supposed to use the talents that God gave us and develop into whole beings. Again, if someone is particularly talented in Torah study, we would say that person should give an extra amount of time. But for the regular folk, they should sort of develop themselves. You know, there is a part of the Talmud that says that when we get to the world to come, we'll be asked why we didn't use more of the kosher pleasures that God put into our universe. And so using our talents and, you know, enjoying the world that God gave us in a kosher way is definitely part of Jewish philosophy. But I think this idea of sort of singing or that sort of thing is considered in some of these most sort of stringent circles to be a distraction. Sort of a good Jewish boy would just sort of stay with his Talmud and keep his nose in there and not get distracted.
Even though they rely on the music for the simchas and for so many other parts, you could see that he was really struggling. Like, am I really going to be just a wedding singer? And it was like a conversation with his wife. Like, he was almost embarrassed to talk to her about it,
right?
And have that. So here's a question that I wanted to ask you, and it's something that I think is very clever, which is that the show is called Shtisel. And it's not called Akiva Shtisel or Shulam Shtisel. Right. So I was curious, in your mind, who do you think is the main character?
That's a good question. And I want to actually, when you mentioned this when we spoke before, I want to actually tell you another reason why I think they call this show Shtisel.
Uh-huh.
One thing that I noticed, okay, before I was Orthodox, I would just go up to people and say, hi, I'm Allison. And then when I became Orthodox, I noticed in some people, maybe in my in-laws are Lubavitch, she would always introduce me Allison Joseph, like my, full name. And I'm like, oh, I can just be Allison. When I've met the Hasidic Jews that we work with in our organization, Makom, they introduce themselves by their last names.
Mhm.
They go around and they stick their hand out and they say Goldberg, Silverman. And I saw them actually at one Shabbat home doing that. I'm like, why don't you say your first names? And they said, because it matters who our family is.
That's right.
Because the Hasidic world or the black hat world, but especially the Hasidic world, they're so close knit. If you hear a family name, there could be just like dozens of cousins coming out, and this one knew that one from that one. So I think part of the show being called Shtisel is sort of to show that it's like the family name that kind of is where things are led by. It's the Shtisel family.
Yes.
In terms of who the show was about, I think it's really a protagonist antagonist type of look of like what your sort of two different possibilities could be. You could kind of stay in the world that you're raised in, or you could try to like push out on the edges. The fact that they have, and I think what makes Akiva lovable is that we see humanity in him. We see him kind of wanting to push things out, but he doesn't actually have to leave in order to become that self-actualized Jew. He could stay within the boundaries of his lifestyle, but still kind of like, sort of push to the edge of them. And we can kind of relate to the desires that he has. And I think that's a really lovely way to show humanity and sort of the ability to relate to his personality without needing him to run away and cast it off and disavow the Judaism in order, to sort of complete his journey.
So let's talk about Lippe for a minute. Because Lippe does leave at the very beginning of the series. So kind of no spoilers here. If you haven't gotten that far, people, come on. Please. And that is something that even in the third season, and I admit I have not finished the third season yet, so that's okay. But even in the third season, that is still very present that he left. So what you see is that Akiva can really self-actualize. I see him dancing with it. I see it as a real dance between his art gallery supporter and benefactor and his need to be in his Shtisel family. So let's talk about Lippe for a minute, because you work at Makom and.
Yeah, so look, the truth is that when I saw that storyline, I'm like, oh gosh, another one of these. Haven't we heard the story 50 million times already? To sort of have the show start off like that, I have to say was a little bit jostling for me, just because I was like, wait, I thought this was the positive Orthodox show. Look, for a lot of people that I'm working with, and again, the people that I deal with are the people that had the most dysfunctional and traumatic upbringings. So the people that are happy are not contacting me. And I've actually made some messages on YouTube. If you're a happy Hasidic Jew, please contact me. And then some women have like reached out to say, hi, we want to let you know we love our life, life is good here. So that actually is a nice balance to hear about that. But the show does start off with him wanting to leave. And for the people that are set up in situations where they don't feel like they have enough autonomy, where they got married to someone they didn't want to get married to, they can feel very trapped in their life. They can feel like they want to get out. And so that was him, I think, just really escaping. I think as the show goes on, we see that his wife is a really controlling character. And I think the show sort of starts off, at least I felt, angry at him for abandoning his family. That's sort of a universal idea of, you left your family behind. But then as the show goes on, we see how controlling Gitti can be. And I would say, without too much spoilers for season 3, he start to speak up for himself and empower himself more on that topic. I also would say that I found the way that Gitti is in complete denial about Lipa leaving and what happened is like beyond dysfunction. And here's the thing, I understand
I say it's heartbreaking. And here's where I counter you about Gitti, because she and Ruchami might tie for favorite characters of mine, although there's so many that I just love. But I find Gitti very empowered. I mean, when she does that shekel exchange,
for sure.
I mean, it is like, I love that. Like, I love that Gitti, like, I'm going to exchange my shekel there for sure.
100%. Yeah, no, I agree that that's definitely an empowering move. She kind of does what she needs to do to take care of her family.
And it's
I'm
funny
saying the
because to go back to the feminist question, she was supposed to be the one working anyway.
right,
So,
it's
so
true.
how fascinating that then she's abandoned. And he
Right.
was working as like a kosher butcher, I think, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly.
Hmm.
So he was doing some parnasa, as you described. But then
Right.
she has to really take it in, and she has so many children and things to juggle. So
Right. It's in the third season that I'm referring to, where you sort of see the two of them butting heads, and we sort of see Gitti like kind of really trying to quash Lipa and his dreams. I don't think you got up to that yet. That's the part that I'm talking about. That like I think she's a little bit too overbearing, but yeah, I think no one exactly has statistics on how many people have left or have tried to leave. It's a very hard thing to come by. It certainly does exist. For me personally, with the show starting off with that storyline we've heard so many times, I didn't love it. And again, I understand that people will deal with traumatic episodes in different ways. The very notion of having a soap opera that the show essentially is that you need drama in sort of every sphere at all times to keep the show moving. The problem is that most families are not that interesting. And so if this is your first exposure to, a Haredi family, even if they have a humanity to them and you can relate to them, and the bubby reminds me of your bubby and you feel kind of like all these like warm feelings, they're still adding on sort of so many extreme things that shows have. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of viewers, we don't always stop ourselves to understand that this is television and not one step further. In fact, my Reform friend that I mentioned earlier went so far as, believing every last thing was true that she said. And how does it work with 16-year-olds getting married? I'm like, 16-year-olds don't get married. But like, it's very, and I will admit to you, I went to a YouTube diversity creator group. They consider me as the Orthodox Jew in sort of the diversity group. There was a Black woman on stage talking about she's so sick of like the sassy, like this kind of Black character. And I'm like, I had never considered before that was like a stereotype that I was being fed. I was just watching the show.
It's
tokenism, exactly.
Tokenism,
exactly. And so I think we have to be careful about that. We have to be careful about are we remembering that these are just characters?
I am going to disagree with you one more time, which is that I've only been a rabbi for almost 20 years. But what I will tell you is I do think every family is just as interesting, just as dysfunctional, just as complicated. I don't believe that there are normal families. I believe that if you bring in the reality TV camera or you tell the true stories of your family, there's a lot of flavor there. And in Americans, some either really tell the stories and some don't. They're like, oh, that's the uncle we don't talk about, right?
Right.
And what I think is very real about it. And this is something, someone made this comment to me the other day. They're like, oh, this is what Shtisel is about. Shtisel is about, moralism, but it's also about everyone lying to each other's faces all of the time. And I found that so interesting because I would never have thought about the show as being about family members that are lying to each other or living lies. Like we all have things about ourselves that we keep very private and things that we wear very comfortably. And so I think that all families really do have these
that much trauma,
spiritual searches, mental illness. Like I'm thinking of Nucham, like lying on the couch after the loss of his daughter. And I mean, it's like, it's terrible to see that. And all of the various things that we see come to life, like we have that. And especially when you're a bigger family, like I'm only one of 4, but there's a lot of different people in the family.
Right. No, I hear you. Yes, like people do have things in their family. I'm just thinking that even reality TV is still scripted. Reality TV still makes it one level up. And even, I can't tell you what degree that, you have to do to make even the show This Is Us or Parenthood, which is sort of like, the American version of the Shtisel. I guess in my perspective, opinion, I'm not a rabbi, so maybe you see more drama than I do from congregants, but I guess I think that, I don't know, they have to kind of like up it a little bit just to keep the show moving, where in real life, you have boring moments. There could be, for this, it's kind of all packed in. There's always moving to the next issue. And I just think as a viewer, it's something to sort of notice, to be wary of, that in real life, they would have quiet moments too.
Yeah, well, I think we discussed this last week, but for me, one of the most unself-conscious moments that they took on in the show is in the third season, where Lippe is roaming around Jerusalem, and he finds them filming ultra Orthodox, these very secular people that are part of Israeli Hollywood, whatever it's called. And he's just, and you can see again, that's his dance. He's like, what is happening
Totally.
here? Spoiler, like he participates as a extra, which I'm sure a lot of people would have a problem with. But it's so interesting to see how they just take that on in the show bravely.
Right. Totally. Yeah, I love that. Do you want to talk about some of the questions that were sent in? Do you want to go or open up questions to the group or?
Ilana Zimmerman. So I want to thank someone very important who's our program director at Valley Beth Shalom, Ilana Zimmerman. And I want to really thank her for designing this thoughtful program, making sure every detail is right. I am not seeing any questions in the chat yet. So don't be shy, everyone. Feel free to share. I'm going to keep asking the questions until I get some from all of you. But let's talk about Zionism, because I said we were going to talk about it. And our synagogue is very Zionist one in many different expressions of what that Zionism is. There is liberal Zionism. There is a stricter Zionism. And I am so proud to be a part of a synagogue that cares so deeply about Israel and the people of Israel. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So this is an important divide of sort of, black hat versus modern. In my world, we see Zionism as sort of millennial old prophecies coming to fruition. That there is this sort of the yearning of the Jewish heart and spirit to return to the homeland. And that thousands of years ago, our prophets said, one day we'll return. The, exiles will ingather from the four corners of the earth. The desert will bloom. I just had a Shabbat meal with a friend who his family made Aliyah years ago, and he quoted a passage of the Talmud which says, one day, when we return, the old people will walk with canes in Jerusalem and the children will run through the city squares with laughter. And he said that he is the old person and his grandchildren are those children. We are living to see those prophecies play out. So in my community, we see Zionism, not just in all the ways that it's seen in the secular way of self-determination and a safe home and refuge for the Jews, but we also see it as really this important religious force of we waited and cried and hoped and begged for a return to our land. And it's finally begun. On the black hat side, it says in the Gemara that we're not supposed to go back to the land until Mashiach brings us there. However, there's one caveat. If the non-Jewish nations really torture us, then we have a way in. So for the people in my camp, the rabbis in my camp, the idea is we think the Holocaust kind of qualified for, a cruel and unnecessary torture. And so we have the permission to go in and self-actualize. What you see on the, Hasidic side, especially Satmar Hasidic Jews, I did not know the previous, Satmar Rebbe. I was told that he was a very righteous and special person. When the state of Israel came around, he called it the work of the Sitra Achra, of like basically the Satan, like trying to sort of confuse people because, this looks so good, but it's really just a trick to the Jewish people. So those are some really strong thoughts. And it's obviously, as an Orthodox Jew, to see anti-Zionism come out from other people in my community that could be associated with me if people don't know the nuances. It's a troubling thing because we feel so proud of Israel as startup nation, proud of Israel, for the Jewish homeland, and proud of Israel as sort of a religious yearning. But they get this idea from this source from the Talmud. But what I will tell you, as sort of all things with Shtisel, and this is what I would say I love most about season 3. What I'm finding in season 3 is sort of there's a pushback happening in the Haredi world of some more modern ideas, sort of pushing back at some more of the old school things, and like the dam sort of, I don't want to say breaking, but just sort of, I would say even our organization having this outlet for Makom, people to change their place, is another thing. There's high tech coming to the Haredi world. There's all sorts of updates that are coming.
You see that in the show, correct? The smartphones slowly make their way in. It's fascinating.
So I would say that even Zionism is starting to come into that world. So look, Shulam is a holdout. He is trying to hold out old school in every way possible. but there's sort of murmurings and pushback of the women driving, of the women getting an education. I mean, that's sort of I loved that storyline in season 3 with Sviaria and his wife. This idea of women kind of telling the man, well, I've got the checkbook, I'm the one working, I'll buy the car. Like, it's sort of like, yeah, you kind of, if you want control, you gave it away. So it's, yeah, I think that there actually is a pushback happening on a societal level. And I love that it's sort of showing the microcosm of that happening with characters.
Yeah, we talked about this before our program started tonight, but one of the very moving scenes for me is Devorah Shtisel, who's the grandmother matriarch and Shulam's wife, when her brother marries a woman named Nechama, and he's notable because he wins the lottery, and she sold him the lottery ticket. I think she works in the lotto thing. So she wants to read Zionist poems at his grave. And you can see on his face, and this is where you said, like, the acting is so powerful, how extraordinarily uncomfortable he is with certain names, and Alterman, this one, that one. And then you see him actually soften. And so you talked about gateways, and you talked about, sort of watershed moments. And so there's certain characters that give us these bridges between the modern world and the Black hat world. And I always find that when we build those bridges, that's where the most beautiful moments happen in the show, because those are the moments of real humanity. And I just want to mention that, because I did my homework, that the Shtisel has won the equivalent in Israel of 11 Academy Awards, which is really a significant and
amazing.
And for the Hollywood people, there is Hollywood buzz that there's going to be a show produced by Amazon called Emes, which is the Yiddish word for emet, or truth, which is also if you think about the letters of the alphabet from Aleph to Tav, with the mem in the middle, that in the full Aleph bet you have emet, you have that truth. And what I read about in the Hollywood gossip is that it's going to be produced by Friends television producer Marta Kaufman and her daughter, whose name I don't know. But anyway, we were talking about the common human stories. We talked together about the big fat Greek wedding phenomenon. That's also part of Shtisel's appeal, that we see elements of shared culture. I'm getting some specific questions about some of the heavier than Zionism, heavier than feminism, but some of the depictions of people being very impoverished. And so I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So, I think we in the Hasidic world, and again, we're talking now about the Lithuanian strain here in Shtisel, even though they're actually dressed very similarly. In the Hasidic world, you will find less of sort of an insistence on sitting and learning, because remember, their sort of culture came originally from being peasants or farmers. And so now within the Hasidic world, you will find people that are very successful businessmen and live in beautiful homes and take beautiful vacations and go to the finest kosher restaurants and dress similar to the characters of Shtisel. So that's sort of one side of sort of like, again, going to that Rebbe's tish and enjoying his food and sort of the full lively experience. Then you go to the other side. So one of the ways that that sort of the Litvish group is described, and as I'm working now, we don't just work with Hasidic Jews, we also work with the Litvish train. One of the ways they're called in Yiddish is Kalte Yeshivish, which is cold Yeshivish. So if Hasidic is warm and bubbly and lebedik, sort of, I guess, more of like the brainiac, nerdy, sitting with the books and just keeping the head down is some of the maybe stereotypical Kalte Yeshivish. The other thing is that I would say, besides the fact that a family of learning is never going to, do so well financially, there is an ascetic strain within sort of Jewish thought. I would say it derives first from a story. People are familiar with Samson and Delilah. So Samson was what we call a Nazir, where they take a vow to not cut their hair and not have any grapes or wine for a certain amount of time. And when it's sort of as a way to dedicate themselves to God, but they're essentially not partaking in the physical world when they sort of become this Nazirite. At the end of their time serving as a Nazirite, they bring a sacrifice. And at that point, the Talmud has a question. Did they bring a sacrifice because it was actually a sin to remove yourself from the world? And really, Judaism wants us to be in the world and elevate the physical with spirituality. I mean, that's the Judaism that I relate to. The Judaism where I can like have nice things, but then also have a spiritual life. The other side of the Talmud says, that he brings a sacrifice because he should have stayed in that ascetic way longer. And so, even from the very beginning, there was this sort of tension within Jewish thought. Should we kind of live off in the mountain like, a monk separated from the world, or is it better to be immersed? So there was a strain of thought in European yeshivas in Russia, because I wanted to get the details of when they came. So I think the Jews that we're seeing, the Haredi Jews we're seeing in Shtisel came in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and then early 1900s. The reason that they are wearing fur hats, which are normally only worn by Hasidic Jews and not by the Yeshivish Litvish strain, you will not see anyone like that in America wearing fur hats, is because they left Europe before it had become banned. There was some sort of ban in Russia where they forced the men to not wear those hats anymore. And so the ones that stayed long enough and came to America just put on like sort of the hats that we see today. But the Jews of Shtisel came earlier. They also came from this yeshiva called Novardik. So the Novardik method was essentially one of sort of self-deprivation, self-flagellation. Their mindset based on this piece of Talmud was sort of like, we, kind of take down the ego. I was just reading that now to review. They would wear clothing to be embarrassed, kind of like shabby looking clothing. So they would sort of get past their ego. I'm sure there's some equivalent to this in some Eastern religion of sort of like getting rid of ego and just sort of like getting down to the basic. Yes. This is not a very mainstream sort of Jewish piece of thought, but it does exist. And I would say they actually in this world sort of value their simplicity. They think it's a holier way of living. In my community, there's obviously, you could go too far. You could be so materialistic that, you've sort of lost, any sort of reasonable boundaries. But what I think is that Shvel HaZahav, the golden mean, is enjoying the world and also, being responsible about it. So what we see there is first, just the economic reality of having pretty much every man learning without, a higher education. As we said, they don't believe in that. And then also having a certain aesthetic value as sort of seeing that as a holier way of living, which again is that specific strain.
Okay. A couple other questions that are coming to us from the chat as we're rounding out our night with you. And thank you for sharing so much of the history that you know. And I find it very interesting to try to understand other cultures almost in like a culture anthropology way, like where does the fashion come from and how does that indicate who we are? And if you're looking for your next TV show that you will love, I highly recommend Srugim, which is a Srug is like the crocheted kippah. And this is specifically I would call it a dramedy about young singles, mostly in Jerusalem, who are part of they wear the srugim, the crocheted kippah, and it's also very beautifully done. If you don't mind that they only use one piece of music for the entire show, which drove me crazy by the end. The acting is so phenomenal. You'll see some familiar faces because there's only a certain group of Israeli actors. I highly recommend it for your next binge watching. And I don't know what the English name is for it, Srugim. I can't think of it. But anyway, I'll put it into the chat. And then I also really recommend When Heroes Fly. And in that show, you will definitely see familiar faces. But if I had to describe it, it would be a combination of learning about Israelis and post-soldier life combined with the American thriller TV program Lost. And it takes place in both Israel and South America, and it is really well done. I loved it. I forgot where we're going. We're actually going to go kind of to the heavy, darker side, which is that a lot of ethical questions were raised about surrogacy,
Yeah.
about pregnancy termination, and about dying with dignity.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there was some insights that you wanted to share about that, and how you saw it
Sure.
demonstrated, and where you think we should hear from you.
Yeah, so just the quick thing about pregnancy termination. The Jewish approach, the halachic approach, doesn't fit neatly into pro-life or pro-choice. It's more nuanced, and I'm proud of the fact that like we kind of can find the nuanced way of being within Judaism. The idea is that we don't have abortion on demand, but at the same time, if there's a need, definitely a life and death need, and then depending on who you ask, mental health will also be brought into it as well. So probably, and look, the truth is that I've actually heard of Hasidic rabbis that are getting more and more knowledge about mental health requirements and making all sorts of allowances within that. So I'm happy to hear that. I can't speak specifically for the rabbis of Shtisel, although I was very happy with how compassionate they showed that rabbi to be. That was actually a really touching moment when Ruchami's husband, Hanania, came in to explain the dire situation. We've just seen so many kind of lousy garbage rabbis on TV in the past. And so it was so nice to see someone that really had wisdom and kindness. The issue of, so again, where the ruling would go, definitely for a case of life and death, it would be. And then certainly in my community, mental health needs would be considered as well. On the issue of surrogacy, it's so strange how he makes it seem so, sort of off the table, off the wall, an impossible thing, and really only allowing it because of life and death. Because my understanding is that it's actually not such an extreme thing to do. And I think there's a little bit of a fear that it gave, again, the wrong idea about orthodoxy. The biggest question about surrogacy that's brought up by the poskim, by the people that are ruling on halacha, is that we're not sure who the mother is. So it sort of creates some complications. Is the mother the genetic material? Is the mother the one that carried the fetus? And then once you do those questions, is it better that the mother would be not Jewish? And then so that way we know that the baby will, not end up marrying someone who's actually a relative and they're being incest, or is it less preferable because if they're not Jewish and they have to convert? So it seems like, yeah, so there's, and the interesting thing is that the Talmud has all different ways of like sort of coming to these different conclusions. Like they talk about, I think, when the imahot were pregnant, they prayed that this one would get this baby. And so it talks about the gender switching during, after conception. And so they're able to use, the poskim are able to use things that are from Jewish sources from thousands of years ago to make rulings on these, really fascinating modern day issues. It seems like most people consider the one that carries the fetus to be the mother, and most people prefer that it should be, that she should be non-Jewish and then convert the baby at birth. That seems to be the most widely held from the research that I did. The fact that it was sort of so verboten, except to save the life, I find interesting because I don't think it's actually as controversial as the show presented it.
So I want to just close with a little anecdote that I heard a report on National Public Radio when we were sort of deep into COVIDness, and it was fascinating to me because it was a little frightening. The journalist was interviewing rabbis and Orthodox people in Israel about what was going right in the Orthodox community in Israel and what was not going right. And they were comparing it to a Muslim country on the other side of the world. And it struck me as so powerful, knowing that we come from a tradition of Maimonides, who was a doctor himself, that some of the more recent decisions that have been made in the Orthodox world have started to, as you mentioned, separate science from Torah.
Yeah.
And there was this terrible story that I'm sure many of the people on this call have heard about, which was that there was a young woman who was pregnant, and they finally convinced her, this Orthodox woman, to get a COVID vaccination. And by the time she actually got it, she had contracted COVID, and she did die, and they lost the baby. And this man, her widow, and the 5 children I think that he had, they did more to encourage people through their storytelling to get the COVID vaccinations than even poster campaigns that showed the greatest rabbis of Israel were getting vaccinated. And it touched me in 2 ways. One was the science Torah, but the other was about the power of storytelling in our community and how relational we need to be in order to understand and see ourselves mentored and reflected in another. So I know that Allison has been so generous with her time tonight, and it's very late on the East Coast. So I didn't know if you just wanted to summarize or say goodbye.
Yeah, the truth, I would love to, since COVID is still, not quite gone yet, and it's in such a big issue from the Haredi world, I would actually like to touch on that briefly, even though it's a little bit off topic. But I mean, if we get back to anti-Semitism and sort of like negative feelings. So just to let you know where my community stood in this, and I would call myself right-wing modern Orthodox.
Okay.
Our rabbis shut our community down before the government asked us to. They saw the writing on the wall. And this is something that says in Ethics of the Fathers, that who is wise, he who sees like what's going to come down the pike. So we really felt like our rabbis had a lot of wisdom. The government of our town had not even shut anything down. And they said, we're a close-knit community. We see each other numerous times a day at shul, at kosher stores, at school. They shut things down. Shul was shut down, until God knows when. Schools are shut down. It was sort of a moment of shock. And because they were so brave, other Orthodox communities around the country followed suit, and like one by one, things shut down within the modern and centrist Orthodox world.
Sure.
Within the more right-wing world, so the Hasidic world is nearly 100% Holocaust survivors or descendants of survivors. This is something that I learned recently. I told you that in the Litvish side, they all got exterminated at home in Lithuania. They didn't make it out if they didn't make it out. But in the Hasidic world, nearly the entire community is made up either of survivors or descendants of survivors. And because there was so much trauma, they basically put themselves into a closed system and had very little interaction with the outside world, which means that the memory that they have of what was done to their family in Europe is still very fresh, because a lot of them, the more insular ones especially, have done less mixing with people to see that there are some good Americans out here, that not everybody wants to chase us and kill us. And so I would say that it is this intergenerational trauma and also intergenerational memory of being used to be tested on that unfortunately has caused some parts of this world now to have, I would say, irrational ideas about things like masks and things like vaccines. It's because, and I would say to you also, the Black community is having a hard time with vaccines. Yes. Why is that? Because they also remember being tested on, and there's also intergenerational trauma. Absolutely. And so we're working now with our members to try to get them over this idea, but it really runs deep, and it's really, it's so part of our foundation. So I think, I guess what I would say is that, I think what brought you here is that you found that connection as a fellow Jew to the show, which I think is so beautiful. I think in the time, as I said at the beginning, of sort of increased anti-Semitism, we must lean into each other and find those common grounds. So thank you for coming out tonight. And in the areas where you see kind of some of these really peculiar or disturbing things in the community, like always ask, send us a question at Jew in the City, because there's usually something under the surface. And look, some things just need to be changed. And actually part of our organization, besides our media arm and Malcolm, we have a third branch called Tikkun, where we actually take the feedback of the things that make the bad headlines, of things that hurt the people in the community. And we're working with leadership quietly behind the scenes to make improvements. And I can tell you, I've had meetings with some of the top ultra-Orthodox leaders, and they are so happy to hear our feedback and make positive change. And so, we're not a perfect community. There's certainly problems, but we certainly need each other now more than ever. And thank you for coming out. Stay safe, be well.
And I want to express so much gratitude to you, almost in a Kaddish de Rabbanan fashion, that your openness, you're willing to help build this bridge between VBS and the Jew in the City. It really matters to me. I want to share with you that I failed one of my things. One of my responsibilities tonight was to show a video that Allison recommended for all of us, Jew in the City on YouTube. And the specific title again was?
It was Man on the Street interviews. What do people know about Orthodox Jews?
And they're wonderful and they're really interesting. So please look at the Man on the Street, Jew in the City YouTube and become familiar with her and her outreach. And I just want to say how much I admire you and admire your work. As a person who identifies with all different parts of the Jewish spectrum, that is, but mostly as a California pluralist, Zionist, something or other, feminist. I think that the more that we can be in dialogue with one another and seek to find the humanity and dignity and the powerful ways that we can recognize each other, that's what's going to help bring Mashiach, whatever that Mashiach looks for us. So thank you so much for your precious time. And I think you have a whole set of rooms of new fans now. And so thank you. We're really grateful for you.
Thanks so much. And Shabbat Shalom to everyone.
Shabbat Shalom to everyone. And I'll say good night on behalf of Valley Beth Shalom and the Valley Beth Shalom Day School. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you again soon, either in person or here on Zoom. Take care, everyone. Good night.